Hello everybody, it's jrobi. I'm going to be doing a match video here that I had on the free internet chess server a while back. And this was actually when I was rated 1474. My opponent was rated 1744. I'm jrobi playing black. And it's kind of an interesting story of how this video evolved. Originally I was going to make a tactics video on the position that resulted in the end of the match. And as I was going through things, I actually almost finished that video. I think I got to 9 minutes. And I realized that this is a great example of one of the hurdles that I had encountered when I was rated in the 1400s. And by hurdle, I mean you probably have experienced in your own chess pursuits that sometimes you'll reach a point in your rating where you're not really progressing higher. And I think the key to getting out of that kind of a ratings freeze is basically to keep training, keep studying, and keep trying things out. And in particularly, I noticed in the 1400 range that I had to focus a lot on how I was looking at the position and how I was playing the position. And eventually, I broke past that barrier, and my rating is higher now. But when I was making the tactics video, I realized that this is a really great example of kind of some of those roadblocks that I was encountering. There was some good things in this match that I did, and then there were some bad things in the match. And I think the good thing, we'll get to it, but basically the good thing is if you have a plan, even if it's a short-term plan, no matter how many pieces you have to move or into what position, as long as you don't have to react or prevent tactics from your opponent's side of the board, take those moves and do them and go ahead with your short-term goal because it will pay off. Now on the flip side of that, the major hurdle I had in this match in the mid 1400s was simply making positional mistakes. And we'll get into the match here and I'll show you exactly what I meant. My opponent opens up with pawn to d4, and whenever I get a queen's pawn opening, I always play knight to f6, and my opponent played pawn to c4, so I get into the nimzo. I play pawn to e6, and basically my goal is to give this bishop access to pin the knight that's going to eventually develop to c3, which my opponent played and the move that followed. So I developed the bishop and pinned that knight down. And from here my opponent develops his knight. And here's where I make a mistake. And it's a mistake that is a positional mistake, but it doesn't hurt me yet. It will in a while, and I'll show you why. But basically from here I play pawn to c6. Now you might notice the plan that I have is basically to push my d-pawn up, and after my opponent captures, to recapture and create a nice pawn wedge for myself. That sounds great, and actually I did achieve that, but there's a problem with that, and I'll show you what that problem turned out to be. I think in retrospect, I think an immediate d5 would have been better here. So after I played pawn to c6, my opponent played pawn to e3. Now he's got a nice pawn island wedge into the center here. So now I go ahead with my plan, and my opponent captures like I was anticipating. I recapture, and I achieve my plan. But there's a problem with my plan. Even though I have a nice pawn wedge leading into the center just like my opponent does, my opponent has the move e3, and the best move for black in that position is to capture. Even the computer thinks so. So when he played a3, I knew immediately that I should just go ahead and take there, and he recaptures with a pawn. But now I think you'll be able to see a problem with my plan here with the pawn wedge, and that's simply him pushing his pawn to c4, and that creates problems for me. Now it doesn't happen right away. I'm allowed to castle, and then he puts his rook onto the b file, putting pressure here. So I respond knight to c6. My opponent develops a bishop. I think this is a good move for my opponent simply because this bishop has access to both sides of the board, and you'll notice that he's got a fairly nice position to work with here, as do I, but I have that positional flaw that's going to come back and bite me here soon. So I wanted to minimize the threat of that bishop, and I play pawn to b6. Now what my plan is, my short-term goal is to trade off the light square bishops, and the reason I want to do that is because his bishop on the light squares can attack all of my light square pieces. So you'll notice I've got a lot of light square pieces here. So this is in effect, this is his good bishop. His other bishop is still kind of blocked in by his own pieces, so it's kind of his bad bishop. So what I want to do is work towards getting his light square bishop off the board. And this is kind of ties into what I was talking a little bit about earlier, in that if you've got a short-term goal, try to do what you can to achieve it, because it does usually pay off. So from here, my opponent castles, and I play my bishop to b7. Now what I'm doing is I'm getting ready to support my bishop with the queen. He plays pawn now to c4 though, and this is where my positional mistake in the early opening of the match comes back to bite me a little bit, because I don't have any good options in this position. I can capture, or I can wait for him to capture, but it doesn't really matter. Either way, he's going to get one of my center pawns for his c-pawn. And in a position where you have all your bishops left, he still has his dark square and his light square bishop. That's good for him. The more diagonals he can get into my position, the better. And opening up diagonals in the center of the board is definitely a good thing for him to do. So from here, I didn't want to capture, simply because he could take back with the bishop, and that would cause some problems also. So what I did is I continued on with my plan. He takes, I recapture, and now you can see, we'll just take a quick moment to look at the board setup here. He's got a very nice pawn wedge still leading into the center. He has an isolated A pawn, but that's not really a big problem at this moment in the game. Now if we look at my pawn structure, it's not as good by any stretch of the imagination. I've got a pawn island here on HG and F. I've got an isolated pawn on D5, and that's going to be very difficult to defend in the long term, especially when you're squaring off against rook that has open access. I've got bishops all over the place and a knight, so really this pawn is going to be very cumbersome to protect. So that's positionally not very good for me. And then I've got these pawns here, which is fine. It's stopping the rook from coming down too far, and they are connected. But in general, he's got a better pawn structure than I do at this point in the match. So he develops bishop out to d2, and I play my bishop out now, continuing on with my plan. And he doesn't capture right away. He moves his queen to c2 instead. So I go ahead and take. So I did accomplish my goal of getting his strong bishop off the board. He captures, and then from here I block his queen now by playing knight to e4. And the reason I did that for the short term is simply because he's got a lot of pieces that could potentially come into my castle position very quickly. He's got the knight that can jump to g5. Once this pawn moves, if ever, the bishop can come in, carving along this diagonal here. And the queen also can come in. So I wanted to stop that queen, and I wanted to kind of stop the buildup of threats that I had on my castle position. So I think knight to e4 was a good move in that position. He plays rook to c1, which is nice because it's pinning my knight down. So I take my queen off of that pin and put my queen onto d7. And he plays knight to e5. I don't have a lot of good choices here, so I just decided to capture the knight. He recaptures, so I double up his pawns. But at this point in the match here, I was looking at the board, and I was starting to realize even more so that my position was getting very dangerous. I've got two rooks here that my opponent has bearing down on these files. I've got a queen that can swing down into the action very quickly, and then I've also got a bishop that can come down on that diagonal. And basically my opponent's pieces are very much more coordinated together than mine are. For example, I've got a rook here that hasn't moved since the castle, and then I've got another rook here that hasn't moved since the game began. And my knight's way over here on e4, and while my knight is accomplishing a goal at the moment, basically my pieces are not connected very well together. So I had to come up with a short-term goal to alleviate that. So what I did is I came up with pawn to f6, and my opponent's best move in this position simply is to take, otherwise he loses the pawn. So he captures, and now I play rook to f6, recapturing that pawn. And my goal is to get my rooks into the action and come up with a kingside initiative here, because I have my knight here and I've got my queen along this diagonal. So if I can get my rooks into the play, I will be able to come up with a nice quick attack here. So my opponent plays pawn to f3. He wants to kick my knight out. So I just decided this time to trade the bishop for the knight. He recaptures, and now I play rook to g6. And as you can see, I'm starting to build up definite possibilities here on his castle position. So my pieces are getting closer together, and I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm going to go through the remainder of the match quite quickly here. He plays rook to b3, and from here I put rook onto f8, so the pressure is mounting. I got some tactics involved here with his pinned pawn. He moves the king off of that pin, and now I play queen to d6, attacking this pawn. Now he doesn't have to worry about this pawn. If I take it, he gets a pawn back with check, and he can fall back to protect his king and the rook from any kind of tactics there, and have a fairly equal footing in the match. He makes a blunder though and tries to maintain his material. This lets me play queen to g3, from which there's a number of tactics in this position. He comes in and checks. I peel the king off, and now he makes a very big mistake. He plays rook to c2, and this leads to a crushing losing tactic that won the game, which is simply rook to d6. Either he's going to lose his queen or he's going to lose the game. He tried to bait me into taking his queen, which would have led to checkmate as he brought his rook down here. But it was too late for him, because after a rook check, the only square the king can go to is e2, and then after that it was checkmate, and that's how the game ended. So it was an interesting match, and especially for me, just going through and looking back at that rating range and finding that hurdle that I had to cross. So talking about the position was a big benefit to me. I hope you guys found it useful as well, and take care, and we'll see you next video.